Hello, it's Council Day, and this is the Coast City Editor, Kira McKenna, running you through everything that happened at the meeting on February 23rd, 2021 at Halifax Regional Council. This week's meeting started at 1 p.m., so it was a shorter meeting, but it still packed lots of agenda items. On the agenda, we had a public hearing at 6 about a development on Dunbrack, and there was a heritage hearing to start off the meeting. We looked at a bylaw about Boulevard Gardens. There was a plan they talked about the Navigator program, the multi-year funding, and we talked about the Halifax Regional Integrated Tourism Master Plan, as well as a plan to contract out accessible transportation for accessible taxis. To begin, Council passed the consent agenda. So the consent agenda is a list of agenda items every week that Council doesn't deem important enough to talk about. And so those agenda items just get passed at the beginning of the meeting, but there is an opportunity for any councillor to say, no, I want to take this item off the agenda, the consent agenda. So one fun thing that was passed on the consent agenda was Sam Austin's motion, the result of Sam Austin's motion to allow Boulevard Gardens, which would be either a garden in the median between two roads or a garden in the space between a sidewalk and the road curb on your own property. So the rules say that HRM can remove the Boulevard Garden if it becomes unsightly, though it doesn't define what unsightly means. So beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and it also mentions things like prohibiting planting of invasive species and the like. So that was a first reading, so it'll come back for a second reading, and then it'll be officially official. First up, we also had a heritage hearing. So HRM decided to give this house on Coburg Road between Walnut and Lamartin Streets heritage status. So the application was brought forward by the homeowner, meaning it was way more likely to be approved than what happens with other buildings when HRM kind of does a roundup of buildings for heritage property distinction. And usually the private interest developers say, no, you can't put that on top of my private property, and it kind of goes south from there. So the land for this particular building was bought in 1886 by Child Fraser for only $350. It was then developed, I think, about 10 or 15 years later. Just for some money math, a similar house on Coburg Road, just down the street from it, sold for $637,000 in 2019, which is a lot more than $350. So this was approved, and this property will now be granted heritage status. And someone actually messaged us and asked, what's the point of heritage status? And it can be contested, but one of the main things is that HRM incentivizes heritage status buildings, so it'll match. There's a matching program. So if you apply and get heritage designation for your property, and then you want to do some external upgrades to preserve the heritage quality of the building, HRM will match your construction project up to $15,000, which is pretty significant. So that's the main reason people apply. And then we talked about the Burnside Comprehensive Business District and a specific application for a tiny chunk of this land. So Councillor Tony Mancini, with the interests of the applicant in mind, he encouraged the rest of council to vote against staff's recommendation on this. So we were actually talking about this small dotted area here, and the applicant wants to be able to put up high-rise buildings and make it a residential area, but the Burnside area is industrial commercial zone, so technically residential stuff isn't allowed. So the applicant wants to be allowed to do that, and HRM staff recommended no, but Mancini encouraged them to strike it down, and then they'll come back with sort of a new plan that'll work best for the applicant. So then council talked about Halifax Regional Municipality's financial contributions to the Navigator Street Outreach program. So Councillor Patty Cuddle will start this off, give some background on the program and why the business improvement districts get involved. Cuddle used to be the executive director of the North End Business Association, which is a business improvement district, a BID. And so she will talk about the program.
Going forward from the bids, part of the business improvement districts, when we look at cities kind of across North America, many cities have kind of taken on Navigator programs to help provide services to homelessness or to those who are in vulnerable situations in our cities, living on our streets. putting in things like public bathrooms, providing shelters, and food programs, and many, many other things. The business associations have played a real leadership role in bringing this type of service to Halifax. And so while, I think some might say, well, it's a strange fit. In fact, it's been a really good fit in that the business associations.
So the request, a specific request was for $45,000 in funding for this year and increasing that to $140,000 annually until 2024. So this program is funded by HRM a little bit, but also the business improvement districts kick in their own money. So this is businesses who have storefronts on Spring Garden Road or in the North End on Agricola Street, who put their own money towards this program, essentially to sort of help with the problem that they see as a problem of having unhoused people living in the area that they want to do their business. So the extra money is being requested so that the Navigator program can increase its capacity to help people who are currently unhoused and those who are currently unhoused or at risk of eviction and homelessness. The program also does all kinds of work. It assists with transit, employment, health services, winter supplies, food, and education. And all of this work is done by only 2 people. So that's $140,000 that HRM will kick in for 2 people to do this huge amount of work. And just to put it into context, in 2020, HRM paid 14 different police employees $140,000 each. It paid 33 different police employees $130,000 each, and it paid 69 different police employees $120,000 each. So it's huge amounts of money for sort of community building work. The Navigator program is definitely also community building work. And that passed. So then Council also approved the development of heritage properties within the South End secondary plan area of Halifax Peninsula, which is just sort of like a overarching plan about heritage properties in the South End area of Halifax to begin with. So some background on the report. The South End area currently has 87 registered municipal heritage properties, which is about 18% of all of the heritage properties in HRM. So staff are estimating that about 20% of the low-density residential building stock in the South End area has some heritage merit. Therefore, about 300 historic buildings may be eligible for heritage designation in this area based on age and architectural merit. And so the reason this is happening is that because within the South End area, there have been 72 demolition applications between 2015 and 2020, which is about 18% of all demolition permits issued in the regional centre during this time. And in 2017 and 2018, the percentage of demolition permits reached about 30% of the year. So the majority of the demolition permits issued in this area were for single-unit dwellings, so houses. And then considering the concentration of historic building stock in the area, it's highly likely that many of the demolition applications were actually for buildings that could have been eligible for heritage registration. So this plan is sort of to make sure that Halifax gets ahead of, calling an area a heritage district before it's all demolished and redeveloped, essentially, if you boil it down. So up next, we were introduced to Halifax Regional Integrated Tourism Master Plan. So we heard from Maggie McDonald, the Manager of Recreation Services with HRM's Parks and Rec Department, and Ross Jefferson, the CEO of Discover Halifax. So they presented sort of this overarching plan. So this was some of the data about the Halifax region visitor economy before COVID. There was 5.3 million overnight stays a year and $1.3 billion in spending. And they estimated that at any given time, 1 in 27 people in HRM were overnight visitors. Halifax actually contributes to 54% of Nova Scotia tourism revenues, and about 4,000 businesses are in Halifax's visitation economy, employing about 34,000 people. And then they had some info about the impact of COVID-19 on the tourism industry. So they forecasted an 85% drop in visitation, an estimated $750 to $850 million in visitor spending lost in 2020 because of COVID. And there's also heavy job losses, as well as a significant impact on tax revenues for all levels of government, because obviously all those businesses and all those employees and everything kick money back via taxes into the cities. So we asked if people lost work in the tourism sector because of COVID-19. 21% of people who looked at this story said yes, which is a pretty hefty chunk. That's 1/5. So you can't turn your screen because you're watching this on YouTube, but I'll read out. This is sort of the like highly graphic designed, kind of sexy design. This is our plan. So the vision is to be widely recognized as the favorite city in Canada. Some of the goals are to grow tourism revenues. They want to grow tourism employment. They want to enrich the lives of residents and align with related strategies. And the way that this is going to happen is through some strategic themes. So they want to build and enhance Halifax's key demand generators. What are those? Who knows? They want to attract the highest yield and growth markets. They want to make it easy to get here and visit, so that relates to sort of transit, taxis, and also like rules around accommodation. They have a catchy phrase where they want to be vibrant and alive, 365, good rhyme. They want to develop responsible tourism, which we're seeing a big push for in the global community, where sort of like cities bending over backwards to attract tourists is actually totally degrading the local economy. You can see that in Lisbon. It got sort of decimated by tourism. It's slowly rebuilding, but it's had a tough time. And they want to establish, identify, and appoint tourism leadership. So, big things, big sort of lofty stuff. And one of the interesting points was they were talking about how Atram wants to not be the biggest or the best city, but the favorite city in Canada. So that's kind of the marketing slogan. And as I was saying, like high-level plans like this can feel really intangible. They're kind of just like up in the sky, like what are we going to do? But they actually have big, wide-reaching impacts because now, every time Halifax wants to do something in the city, whether that be like build bike lanes or whatever, because this is an overarching plan, whatever that new thing is, it has to align with this larger framework. And this larger framework obviously prioritizes the interests of like tourism business industries and people looking to like make money off of tourism. So one example of that is short-term rentals. So it was actually mentioned in the report. So short-term rentals, we know from lots of different sources, has really screwed up the housing market and the affordability of rental markets. And Halifax is looking right now at regulating short-term rentals, but obviously a tourism master plan would like to see short-term rentals and see them continue. So the most interesting part of this I'll read to you is new and updated regulations will be intended to support the tourism industry and residents' participation in the sharing economy, while also reducing negative impacts of long-term housing supplies and residential neighborhoods. Which, if you ask me, those two things can't really happen at the same time, or we've yet to see a good example in sort of the last 10 years of a city that's managed to do both of those things well. And just as a reminder, when Halifax Regional Council was talking about short-term rentals back in the fall, councillors not all, but a majority of the councillors were pretty outspoken about the need to really advocate for and on behalf of like renters and people who are actually getting screwed by the housing affordability. And I believe it was one of the councillors said, if you can afford to like buy up a second property and put it out on Airbnb, you don't need our help. So we need to help the people who, need to rent. So just as a fun reminder. And there was also a request in that big plan for a levy. So that would be HRM adding a levy onto Airbnbs the way it has a levy on hotels. And HRM asked for this needs provincial approval to do a levy like that. So they asked for a similar one on Uber and Lyft rides, and the province told the Coast when we followed up on the request for the levy that the province has no plans to change that legislation. A per-trip fee would increase costs and undue administrative burden on ride-hailing companies. The goal of this regulation is to reduce red tape. So that levy was just a 20-cent per-trip fee that would have gone right back into municipality to fund accessible transit and like climate sustainability initiatives. And it was totally shut down by the provincial government. Provincial governments change, that could change, but that's sort of where the relationship between the municipality and the province is on attaching levies to these companies like Airbnb and Uber to sort of make it a bit more sustainable to let them operate in the city. This big tourism plan also requires an extra $250,000 to the budget for this year. So because that's over the budget request, it's added to the budget adjustment list, also known as the parking lot. Also on that list right now are $100,000 for electronic resources and $50,000 for food programs for the the Halifax Public Library's business unit. So all of these sort of extra requests will be debated later on in the budget process. So here are the official recommendations, and that passed. So the next item on the agenda was presented by Patricia Hughes, HRM's Manager of Planning and Scheduling, and it was about an on-demand private accessible transportation service contract. So the current situation for accessible transit in Halifax is bad. There are very few accessible taxis. Those that exist have really limited hours, and the accessible service lends little flexibility. We have heard that the accessible service has improved because of COVID, because overall demand is down, but it's still just sort of like it's not a perfect solution, and people who need mobility devices to get around have a really tough time. And so this story we reported in early 2020 gave sort of a tiny glimpse at how these systems fail folks with accessibility needs. I'll put the link to this article in the comments and you can read it. So in order to address kind of this bad situation, HRM staff is recommending that the municipality procure a service to provide transportation to folks that use mobility devices that would be just as good as the services able-bodied Haligonians can access whenever they want by calling a taxi or opening up an app and booking one. So the way this would work is the provider would get money from the rider and from HRM, and ideally HRM kicks in the money to balance it out. Because we heard a lot during the taxi review process that running accessible taxis is just not financially viable. There's more upfront costs, there's more maintenance costs, and you can make less. The profit margin is lower because it takes longer to pick up and drop off your passengers. So at first estimate, HRM is saying it'll need about 5 to 10 taxi vehicles to meet the demand, and they estimate that the program could cost between $280,000 and $600,000 annually. The big discrepancy there is because it depends on whether or not, there are a few accessible taxis in the province or in the city. Are they going to group together and start a business so they already have the fleet, or will they have to go out and purchase and retrofit all of these vehicles? So that's the big price difference. But Hughes said that if it was approved today, which did happen, they hope to see the program operating by fall 2021. So that passed. And so when you get to the end of the meeting, there are in-camera items, which we don't get to know about because they're in camera, so they're private. But there's also a thing where councillors put forward notices of motion. So they say, I'm going to talk about XYZ at the next meeting. So we heard about Mancini plans to put forward a motion to look at stricter rules for illegal dumping. And someone brought forward a motion to get more information on sidewalk snow clearing. And so we've got a fun video up next that introduces an interesting perspective on sort of the hierarchy of needs and what we do first has lots of implications, and how a gender-based lens on those things can sometimes improve policy.
Have you learned about snow plowing in Sweden and the difference it makes to consider women and gender in decision making? A council in Sweden was looking to see how gender affected their decisions, and one man said, "At least we don't have to worry about snow plowing. I'm sure that's easy." To which the women said, "Let's see about that." They learned that the major arteries and then the smaller roads and then the sidewalks were being plowed first. Although this might seem to make sense, cars do a lot better going over an inch of snow-packed roads than strollers do over sidewalks. Men also only drive to and from work typically, while women run smaller errands on smaller roads and push strollers or wheelchairs over sidewalks. By switching the order and clearing sidewalks and small roads first, Sweden saved tons of money since way less pedestrians were being injured, 69% of whom were originally women. This story shows the importance of including women in decision-making and considering gender and development.
So that was it for the Coast's Instagram Live reporting of the meeting. There was a public hearing at 6 p.m. for amendments to the planning rules for development proposal on Dunbrack Street. That was approved. And thanks for following along. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, leave them down below, and we will talk soon.